in chapter 11.
It's talking about dietary law, food.
And what did it have to say about food?
What was clean and unclean?
Yes, and it's the Lord who determines that, right? So he decided for the people the things that were unclean and things that were clean. In other words, the things that are edible and the things that aren't. Why? Why does that matter?
Sets them apart in terms of their dietary restrictions
Sets them apart from who?
from the Gentiles, from the pagans.
Yep, from all those nations around them. So it separates them from the Egyptians that they left behind. It separates them from the Canaanites where they're going. Why does that matter? Why does God want to separate them that way?
They're set aside for him. They've been set aside.
That's right. They belong to him, and he does not want them to get assimilated into Canaanite worship and culture. And it's not just food that makes the difference, but food is one of the most basic things, one of the most fundamental ways that you separate people when it comes to fellowship or comes to how much time you spend, sitting and eating with your neighbors. And so the Lord is intentionally putting some boundaries in place in order to keep the people from becoming Canaanized. And this isn't the only thing he'll do. There are other things that he will do too, but it's just a basic sort of fencing the people off from the nations around them. And that's not because he wants them to stay isolated. It's because he wants them to be the light in the middle of the darkness. He wants the nations around them to look at Israel and to realize they have a different God. They worship a God who's very different from the false gods of the other nations. How are the nations going to see that if the Israelites just blend in with everybody else? Now, ultimately, it's not about physically what you eat. It's pointing to spiritual things. All of these physical impurities are pointing to bigger spiritual realities. But the Lord starts with the kinds of physical things that are right in front of you that you have to think about. Every day, the sorts of things that you eat that will make you impure. And if they're paying attention to that, the hope is that they would be paying attention to other kinds of impurity as well, including spiritual impurity, in order to be separate from the nations and to be the light in the dark. Okay, anything else you want to mention from last week? There's a woman in one of the Bible studies in Riverton who told me I can't remember if she missed this one or I don't remember, but anyway, she watched the live stream from last week. She's like, wow, you got a couple of real live wires in that group. I was like, yeah.
Who is she referring to? What'd you say?
I was like, you should come one of these days and put a face with a name with a face, or a face with a voice. And she's like, yeah, I should. Okay, so let's look at the chapter that comes next, which is chapter 12. Now, these next several chapters, before I read it, let me just say these next several chapters are challenging in large part because this idea of ritual purity is not so much a part of our culture. Now, when I started reading up on this whole concept, I was actually surprised to find that modern Western cultures are unusual in this way. Globally and historically, most cultures and religions have had, and a lot of them still have, concepts of ritual purity, which is why I gave you that extra handout last week, and you're going to get another one of those this week, this idea of ritual purity that spans all kinds of cultures through history. So there's evidence of that with the ancient people groups like the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, even the Chinese. They all had ideas of ritual purity. There's plenty of evidence of that too in modern times. Lots of people groups in Africa and Asia and the Middle East have beliefs and practices related to ritual purity. A lot of Native American tribes actually do as well. So I used to read Tony Hillerman mystery novels, and if you read one of his novels, there's ritual purity among the Navajo that shows up in those books, and so it's very common in a lot of religions and cultures. Now, all that to say, the purity laws in Leviticus might seem strange to us, and it's natural to try to work out the rationale behind all of these laws, but it wouldn't have been strange to the Israelites at all, because this is just the religious air that they breathe. This is exactly what they would expect from religious practice, from any kind of worship system. It's what they would have come out of in Egypt, and it's the way religion would have been done. So we've seen before that the Lord makes use of practices and beliefs that are already familiar to the people in order to communicate theological truths, and he's going to do that, continue to do that with ritual purity. Now that's not to say that the Lord's just a latecomer to all this. Like one day he just noticed all these purity laws in all these various cultures and suddenly was like, oh, that's a good idea, I'll just piggyback off of that. I think rather that the concept of ritual purity is probably so widespread because God had been using those kinds of physical metaphors to communicate with people about sin and holiness from the very beginning. Now, we know that's true at least from the time of Noah, because in Genesis 7, in the story of Noah, there's already a distinction between clean and unclean animals when it comes to sacrifices. Now, if that's the case in Genesis 7, everybody already knows that. That would seem to indicate that God was using this kind of idea of ritual purity even before that to communicate to people about sin. So, again, it's something the Israelites probably wouldn't have thought twice about because it wasn't new or novel for them. But the Lord doesn't just then allow them to do whatever they want based on their own experience, right? He doesn't say, okay, you already understand this idea of ritual purity, you know what to do. No, because when the Israelites are left to their own devices, they end up with golden calves. So the Lord is making use of these familiar forms, but he is very specific about what they are to do and how they're to do it, because he wants to ensure that the rituals communicate the correct theological truths to the people. The ultimate goal of all this that's being communicated in the ritual purity and in the sacrifices that deal with ritual purity, what all that's ultimately communicating is the truths about the gospel. Now, how do clean laws serve that purpose? Well, in the same way that different sacrifices communicate different aspects of Christ and his work for us, the clean laws communicate different aspects of sin and what it does to us. So sin is complex and it's nuanced, and the salvation that Christ has accomplished for us has to address all of those different nuances and complexities. And all of that's being pictured through the metaphors of the physical impurities. We'll talk more about that when we get to the end. Now, in the previous chapter, we saw that the laws with the dietary laws, that addressed external sources of pollution. So the unclean animals and the carcasses and how people were instructed to deal with all of that, and you avoid touching certain things or eating certain things. But all of that stuff that comes at you from the outside. The next several chapters are going to deal now with things that have to do with human uncleanness. So this is the kind of stuff that doesn't come at you from the outside. It's the kind of stuff that affects you just because you're a human being. And a lot of the things we're going to see in these chapters are things that you can't control. Like you don't have any control over some of the things that make you impure. It just happens because you're a human. And that's going to be the case in this chapter too, in chapter 12. But all of these things are being used to communicate spiritual realities to the people. That pollution is not just something that comes at you from the outside, it's something that comes out of you from the inside. And that's a great metaphor for sin, which we'll talk about a little later. Okay, so let's look at chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. If she gives birth to a daughter, for 2 weeks the woman will be unclean, as during her period. Then she must wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. When the days of her purification for a son or daughter are over, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or a dove for a sin offering. He shall offer them before the Lord to make atonement for her, and then she will be ceremonially clean from her flow of blood. These are the regulations for the woman who gives birth to a boy or a girl. If she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. In this way the priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean." Okay, so how does the chapter begin in verses 1 and 2?
The Lord spoke.
Why does that matter?
It's God's law.
That's right, and that's going to show up next week and the week after and the week after and the week after and the week after. Because everything that's being commanded of Moses, it's important that it comes from the Lord. That Moses isn't just looking around at the nations that surround Israel and saying, okay, I think we'll do this or I think we'll do that. No, all of it comes from the Lord. Because you know how dangerous it is to approach the Lord without coming the way that he commands. We already saw that in chapter 10. So
and
it matters.
he's not talking to Aaron.
He's not. He's talking to Moses, right? And he'll come back to Aaron when he gets to the commands that specifically have to do with the priests. But now because he's addressing this to all of the Israelites, it's Moses who's going to communicate this to the nation. Yeah. Okay, so he has a word for the Israelites, and what is it in verse 2?
It's regarding uncleanliness following the birth of a child,
Mm-hmm.
specifically first a male child.
Yeah. Now, right here, I'm going to reiterate, ritual impurity is not a sin. That's really important for understanding this chapter and the next several chapters. Failing to deal with impurity properly is a sin, but the impurity itself is not. So right here in chapter 12, there's no implication of reproach for a woman because she gives birth, as if having a baby is a bad thing. It's not. It's a good thing. And Scripture makes that clear in a bunch of different places. So the ritual impurity, well, why would she be ritually impure? Because she has a baby. What is it that would make her ritually impure? The blood. That's right. It's the blood. That's what brings the ritual impurity. And so this isn't, this isn't the only bodily discharge that makes a person ritually unclean. We're going to get a whole long list of them in chapter 5. But that's why the purification is necessary, not because there's a problem with having a baby, but because the loss of blood and other bodily fluids causes ritual impurity. Okay, now, it's significant that not only is there an entire chapter given to childbirth, even though it's short, it's got its own section. It's also significant the cleansing ritual is a lot more complex than usual. So you notice last week we didn't have anything this complex when it came to ritual impurity. This ritual actually occurs in 3 stages, and it occurs over a fairly lengthy amount of time, and the purification process involves time and sacrifices. And I think the reason for that is in order to emphasize the uniqueness of this particular event. Unique not only because childbirth is probably the most dramatic and dangerous natural process that a human being can experience, but also because the arrival of new life is accompanied by reminders of the mortality and impurity that separate people from God. Now, we'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so the chapter starts with the Lord giving these instructions that if a woman becomes pregnant, gives birth to a son, she's ritually unclean for 7 days. And it says that she's unclean for 7 days as she would be if she had her regular monthly period. Now, what that means is, we'll get to that in chapter 15, but what that means is that the impurity not only lasts 7 days, but it's communicable to anybody who touches her or anybody who comes into contact with anything on which she sat, and it also makes sexual relations with her off limits. So the communicability of her impurity, that doesn't mean that her family and friends can't touch her. It just means that they become temporarily impure. And for them, it's a minor impurity where you just wait till the end of the day, done. But there might be a practical benefit in all of this, because if the woman's ritually impure, it gives her a really good excuse to stay home with her baby for a while, right? I was telling Lindsay, there was somebody else who said to me, I wish I could bring this back so that you could just stay home with your baby and you have a good excuse to not go anywhere. But whatever the case, there's minor impurities for anybody who touches her or touches the things that she touches, but for her, it's a major impurity, and that impurity has to be dealt with in multiple stages. Okay, so after a wait of 7 days, 7, of course, because 7's always the time period. It's symbolic of completion. After a wait of 7 days, the woman enters the next stage of ritual impurity, or ritual purity. So she's not fully clean, but she's as clean as this particular stage can get her. Now, what happens with this boy after 1 week? Yes, he's circumcised on the 8th day. So it's important that the mother is allowed to participate in that. She's not as clean as she could be, but she's clean enough to participate in this. She can be present for the circumcision without passing ritual purity on to anybody else. So the implication then is after that 1 week, her impurity can't be passed on to anybody else. So the day of circumcision was important not only because of the ritual that was performed, but also because it was typically the day when a boy was given his name. But remember that from Luke 1 with the mother of John the Baptist. So normally a mother would be present for this. So it matters that she's no longer she no longer passes on the impurity to somebody else. She's not fully pure, but her impurity cannot be passed on to other people by touching them. Okay, now what are the instructions then that are added for the second stage of purification in verse 4?
33 days.
Mm-hmm. So the second stage starts on day 8, and it's added because there's postnatal discharge that lasts longer than a week. So the woman is still unclean, but she's not as unclean. And the implication is that her uncleanness, because it's no longer communicable. She can be in contact with other people, but she's not allowed to touch anything sacred, which would be the meat of a fellowship offering, or to enter the courtyard of the tabernacle. She can't do that until the full days of her purification are over. So it's like a sort of middle stage of purification. So the fact that it lasts 33 days is interesting because that brings the total to 40. And the number 40, like the number 7, denotes thoroughness or completeness in the Bible. You know, there's lots of times when the Bible mentions 40 days and 40 nights. This again is not a matter of hygiene, it's ritual impurity that's being dealt with. And so the numbers are symbolic as well as practical. So at the end of this time, at the end of 40 days, the mother would have undergone a thorough wait, and now she's ready to transition fully from being ritually impure to being ritually pure. The whole time element of the purification process is finished, and then she moves on to the last stage, which is sacrifice. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But before that, what does it add in verse 5?
Talks about a female child.
Yep. How's it different? I know that got your attention.
Everything's doubled. Doubles everything.
Everything's doubled. For the birth of a daughter, everything's doubled. So the initial stage of uncleanness lasts for 2 weeks instead of 1. The second stage lasts for 66 days, so that's 80 days total. Okay, now why would there be a difference based on the sex of the baby? Now, there's a whole lot of ink spilled on this with a whole lot of people who think that it demonstrates an ancient prejudice against women. Or that it somehow indicates a difference in the value or the status of the baby. But now do you have something to say?
Oh,
I saw that hand.
I know mothers and daughters really bond. I had boys. And so maybe it allows extra bonding time. That's a positive spin on it. Because I read your notes and there's not really a clear answer.
Yeah, but I'm going to make a suggestion here.
Okay.
Yeah. The thing is, we already know from chapter 4 that if there's a difference in status for the person it's being offered for, there's a difference in the value of the offering. Do you remember that from the purification offering and how people of different status had to offer a more or less valuable offering? So is there a difference in the value of the offering here for a boy than there is for a girl? No.
Not the sacrifice.
No, the sacrifice is the same. So how can it be communicating that there's a difference in the value or status of the baby if the sacrifice is actually the same? Now, I suspect that you already don't agree with that idea because you know you're God, right? You know that God does not value boys more than girls. He doesn't place a higher value on the baby because of its sex. And So so there's other things that people suggest as reasons why there would be a difference. One of the things that I read too was that people speculate the discharge that follows childbirth lasts longer for a baby girl than for a baby boy. I don't know if that's true, but I couldn't find any evidence of that one way or the other. I kept looking around trying to figure out if that was true, and I couldn't find anything about it. Even if that were true, I think you'd expect then the length of the purification time to just be extended. But it's not extended, it's not just extended here, it's actually doubled, which is very interesting. Now, the fact is, I'm not positive why there's a difference, but there's one particular commentator who made a suggestion that I found really interesting. And what he said was, it's not uncommon for newborn baby girls to experience vaginal bleeding. Now, I had never heard of that before, but it turns out there's a woman in one of the Bible studies in Riverton who's a retired OBGYN. So I asked her, I said, is that true? And she said, absolutely it is. And I said, okay, why does that happen? And she said, because of the massive hormonal change when a baby girl is born. So you have a baby girl who the mother's estrogen is just flowing through her system. At the point when she's born, there's a huge hormonal change, and it's that hormonal change that can sometimes cause the baby girl to start to bleed. And she said, the thing is, it can be alarming if you don't know what to expect, but she said it's totally harmless. It usually only lasts a few days, and it's actually not uncommon. And I was like, I know, me too. I was like, really? I never heard of it either. And then I went and looked it up on the internet, because if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. And I found multiple medical websites that actually have medical information for new moms that mention this same sort of thing. Like, if this happens, don't be alarmed, because it's not uncommon.
So did it mention the baby having breast milk?
Mm-mm. Is that a thing too?
Because my first one had the discharge and had the breast milk, and I was breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on here? So that's interesting.
But the hormonal,
The hormonal.
change.
that I was told.
Mhm. Now, if that's the case, I know, I was like, really? But then when I talked to her, she's like, yeah, it's true. I said, okay. Now that's interesting, because if that's the case, it would make total sense to me now why there would be the extension of the purification, and it's not just extended, but it's doubled. Because if the little girl what is it that the purification's for? It's for the discharge of blood, right? If the baby girl bleeds as well, then wouldn't it make sense that you would have purification for two instead of just one? Now, the text isn't explicit about that, so I'm not going to go, this is not a hill I'm going to die on. But to me, there's something that makes sense in that picture of the mother undergoing purification for two people, for herself as well as for her baby girl. Now, there was another woman in Riverton who's like, okay, what if she has twins? I don't know. And she's like, what if she has a boy and a girl? They have a twin brother. And I was like, I don't know. What if she has two girls? What if she has triplets? Like she's out of commission for like a half a year. I don't know, but I think because the picture here is that it's the blood that's important. I think that's why there's the doubling of the purification.
Say that again.
Because it's the
The blood
blood
is
that's
the
important,
important, okay.
because that's what's being purified. I think that's why the time of purification was doubled, because there's a purification for two people instead of one. But, yeah, again, I'm not going to die on that hill. Okay, now, after that, we get to the last stage of purification, which is in verses 6 to 8. What does the woman do after the days of purification are finished?
She takes her sacrifice to the priest,
Mm-hmm. What does she take?
a year-old lamb, if she can afford it, or, and,
A young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering.
Right.
yeah, she takes two sacrifices.
That's right. And then the priest offers them before the Lord to make atonement for her, and she'll be fully and finally ceremonially clean. And if she can't afford the lamb, then she can bring 2 birds instead. Okay, now right here, she brings the year-old lamb for the burnt offering, the young pigeon or the dove for a sin offering, and it's important right here to know that when we talk about a sin offering, specifically what we're talking about is a purification offering. Because if you come at this thinking it's just for sin, well then you can, I used to always read this and think, why do you have to bring a sin offering for having a baby? It's not a sin. Because this one offering does double duty. It covers the purification of both physical impurities and spiritual impurities. So there's no implication that there's sin here, but the same offering is offered here as a purification because of the blood. So even though the burnt offering's mentioned first, the purification offering was the one that would logically come first in the order. And then the burnt offering, after this symbol of purification in the sin offering, then you get the burnt offering, which is symbolic of the whole picture of atonement. Again, there's no sin involved, but atonement is still necessary because the impurities have to be taken care of for God and his people to be in fellowship together. You might have noticed, though, that there's no mention of forgiveness. Okay, we saw that a lot in the instructions about sacrifices earlier. There's no mention of forgiveness because there's no sin involved. So she comes to be purified, she comes for the atonement, but all of that is because of a physical impurity. All right, now, having come to the end of this very short chapter, I want to stop and just consider some questions. So I mentioned before, there's an entire chapter, which is chapter 15, that's devoted to the uncleanness that results from bodily discharges. So the first and obvious question is, why isn't childbirth included there? Like, that would seem to be the very natural place to put these 8 verses. It's just to put it together with all the other discharges mentioned in chapter 15. Why is childbirth separated out and treated as an entirely different topic?
It brings forth life.
Yes.
Other discharges don't.
What'd you say?
I said it brings forth life.
Life.
Mm-hmm.
And children are a blessing from our Lord.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And it's all of that goes along with not only why it's separated out, but why it's fronted. Right? So you could put childbirth, you could have made it chapter 14, because then it'd be right next to all the other stuff with discharges, but it's moved to the front. This is the very first thing that we're dealing with when it comes to human uncleanness, is what comes because of childbirth. And not only that, why is the purification process so lengthy and so complicated? Purification for other bodily discharges isn't nearly this involved. What's so special about this one? It's the coming of new life, and at the same time, there's a connection, I think, to Genesis 3. And Genesis 3 is the curse. Okay, now, what does the curse have to do with childbirth?
Pain.
Yep. So you start off with the particular curse on women that involves pain, but there's a bigger general curse too, which is that now death comes to everybody because of sin. When sin enters the world, part of the curse on all of humanity is that death results from that. Now, think about the vividness of the picture involved now with childbirth. I mentioned before, of all the natural bodily processes human beings experience, childbirth is the most dangerous, and it's the most life-threatening. The discharge of blood is normal, but if it doesn't stop, the woman will die. And that's a very serious risk every time a new human life comes into the world. And why is that? Because of the curse. Again, not just the specific curse that childbirth is accompanied by pain, but the more general curse that new life is accompanied by reminders of mortality and the sentence of death. Reminders that are made very vivid through the loss of blood that accompanies childbirth. So every birth contains this little echo of the curse from Genesis 3. And I think that's why it's emphasized, why it's separated out, why it comes first in the list, and why it's so involved. Because unless the Lord heals and preserves the woman, the curse of Genesis 3 will consume her. And that's why the sacrifices of purification and atonement are appropriate, because they deal with the realities of the human condition after the fall. Now, here's the thing. How does she get loose of all those impurities? How does she get cleansed of all that?
Waiting and sacrifice.
Waiting and sacrifice. And ultimately, I mean, the waiting is because you have to go through certain stages before you can offer the sacrifice. Ultimately, it's the sacrifice that cleanses her from the impurity. Okay, now think about that in relation to the curse of Genesis 3. What is it that ultimately gets us loose of the curse of Genesis 3?
Jesus died on the
Sacrifice.
The sacrifice, right? All of that leads you to this picture that a sacrifice has to be made for us in order to get us loose from the mortality that is right there at every birth of a child, right? The consequences of the curse from Genesis 3, the only way we get loose of that is through the sacrifice of Jesus. Okay, now, why does all of that matter in the bigger picture? What we're going to see as we go through all of these chapters on ritual impurity is that when it comes to God dealing with our sin, forgiveness alone is not enough. Because if forgiveness were enough, what that would imply is the only problem with sin is that you have a broken relationship. So, you break a relationship in order to be reconciled, one person forgives the other, and you're all good, right?
Yeah.
But sin has a much bigger impact than that. Sin is not just about broken relationships. What else does sin do to you? What else does sin do to you?
Separates you from God.
Mm-hmm. What else does it do?
Makes you unclean.
It makes you unclean. It pollutes things. It taints things. It spreads to other people, doesn't it? Right? Like you can't bring... if you bring a highly contagious disease into your house, does it just stay in the corner where you put it? No, it spreads everywhere, and sin is the same way. We're going to get that picture over and over and over in the chapters that come, is that sin pollutes, and it spreads, it's contagious, it affects other people, it eats away at you, it eats away at relationships, it eats away at all the people that come in contact with it. What does it do to creation?
Ultimately, it kills it.
It kills it. That's right. It causes death. Sin is not just an action that you do. It does some damage, you fix the damage, and everything's okay. Sin permeates everything. It permeates all of creation, and it brings a curse on all of creation. So in order for God to deal with sin, he not only has to provide a means of forgiveness, he has to provide a means of cleansing the pollution, of fixing the damage, of paying your debt, of taking the just penalty from his own law. He has to stop the killing effect of sin. He has to somehow stop the corruption and the corrosion, and he has to remove the curse on creation. He has to deal with all of that. And how does he do that?
Christ.
With Christ. There's one sacrifice that does all of it. But sin is so much more nuanced than I think we sometimes treat it in the church. I'm just saying that from my own experience, but I feel like we don't talk a lot about the polluting effect of sin, the tainting effect of sin, how it is that sin affects other people, not just the people you sin against, but how it eats away at you, and it eats away at people, it eats away at relationships, and then it eats away at creation, right? There's so much corruption in creation. That's the result of sin. And the way all that gets stopped is through the sacrifice of Jesus. It's the death of Jesus that deals with all of that. Now we see all of that get divided out into different kinds of impurities that are dealt with using different kinds of sacrifices. But ultimately all of this is pointing to one sacrifice that does everything, and that's the death of Jesus.
Sally, do the Jewish women still practice this?
I don't know if the Orthodox women do or not. I don't know.
And it wouldn't mean much because they don't see Jesus on the cross.
Well, they're still waiting for the Messiah.
Yeah, but they don't
So-
see him who...
They wouldn't understand it the way that,
Yeah.
that we do. Yeah, that's right.
I think they do practice this. I heard of a guy say that he couldn't sit in the car with his wife, because she was menstruating, and he couldn't sit on the same driver's seat that she had sat on, even though she was in clothes and stuff. It wasn't like she had gotten blood on the seat.
So they do that monthly too?
But he was like, I'm unable to sit in the spot where she sat and touched, and that was in modern times.
I think if you would go back east where there are large communities of Jewish people, and depending on which sect of Judaism they practice, Orthodox or, I don't know how many there are now, I think you would be amazed. Jerry used to work, when he was younger and fresh out of art school, he used to work for his cousin who had an interior business, wallpaper, paint, murals, stuff. And his primary business was in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which was a huge Jewish community. They would refurbish their entire household before Passover.
Mhm.
Jerry got in trouble one time because apparently they were allowed to use the kitchen while they were working, and he used a wrong dish, and the woman had to throw out the whole set. So I think you would be amazed.
She had to throw out what?
The entire set of
The
dishes.
entire set.
The entire set, because he put milk in something that wasn't supposed to have milk in, or something like that. It was just,
So they must not have trans Jews. I mean,
I
I'm
wouldn't
thinking
go
about
that far.
I
They
don't
don't
know.
have trans
I
Jews.
don't know.
Well, they can't complete the process either.
No.
They can't do the sacrifice.
No, they
It's
can't.
all outer, it's all
Mhm.
ritual.
So you can follow, they can follow certain parts of the
Right.
ritual, but not the entire
Right.
ritual, because you can't, there's no temple to take your
Right.
sacrifice to.
So logistically, like, in this time, did the man leave the house? I mean, how could he have even, he wouldn't have been able to sleep in his bed or to,
He can sleep in his bed,
he's
because
just
it's not a sin to
unclean
become
until-
impure.
Okay, so
You
he's
just
just
have to-
unclean until the.
That's
okay.
right,
So
you just have to
sunset.
deal with it the
Okay.
right way. So we'll get to some of this in chapter 15, but what that means is, if you have someone impure in your house, and just to encourage you, when we get to chapter 15, it's men and women both who cause impurity, right?
Yeah.
So, let's just switch it around for a minute. So let's say that your husband is impure, you live in the house with him, you touch things that he touched and that makes you impure. That's not a sin, and you don't have to offer a sacrifice for it, but you have to wait until evening to be clean again. So what that means is, you can't sit where he sat at 10 o'clock this morning and go to the tabernacle and make a fellowship offering at 2 o'clock this afternoon. You have to wait until the next day to participate in anything that requires that kind of consecration, that requires you to deal with holy things. So it's enough inconvenience that you are going to be mindful of it all the time, but not so inconvenient that it would keep you from being able to fellowship with the Lord. But think about how then you're going to be thinking about issues of purity and impurity all the time, aren't you? Day in and day out, this is something that you're going to be mindful of. Why is the Lord doing that? Is it because he wants them to be like obsessive compulsive? Or is there something else going on?
He wants them to realize that he is purity in itself, and in order to have fellowship with him, they have to be pure, and we just are such imperfect beings that for us in this room, without the blood of Jesus, we'd be doing the same thing. Every thought, word, I mean, how often does something impure sneak into your brain, into your mind, into your thoughts?
Well, and then, let's take it a step further. How mindful are you of holiness?
Not enough.
Day in and day out,
Not enough.
right? How much time do you really spend thinking about the holiness of God, and how just all the everyday things either contribute to you knowing him better or put you farther away from him? I mean, I think there's an intent underneath all of these physical impurities to take the people to the point where they're thinking about the spiritual things. And then thinking about, okay, what is it that puts distance between me and God? And how do I get rid of it? How do I deal with those things? Because it's not the physical impurities that matter, it's the sin that matters. But how mindful are we intended to be about sin?
We constantly need reminded.
Yeah. Not because God wants you to be obsessive compulsive, He wants you to live in grace, but because you can't experience intimate fellowship with a God that you're constantly at odds with. Right? How can you have intimacy with somebody that you're constantly at odds with? And so God says, be holy for I'm holy. In other words, if you want to belong to Him, pursue holiness. Because holiness is what characterizes God. And the more you pursue holiness, the more intimately you'll know a holy God. But close fellowship with the Lord requires holiness. What better motivation is there to pursue holiness than to know I will know God better by loving what He loves and hating what He hates and being mindful of the things that put distance between Him and me. Yeah. I'm glad we don't have to do this too. But then I think, how often do I go through an entire day without even thinking about holiness? And then you get to the end of the day and you're like, oh, what did I watch and where did I go and what did I say and what came out of my mouth at that, and I didn't even think about it. Yeah, there's this idea that we should be mindful of holiness and purity. And the thing is, when you realize how impure you are, what do?
Ask for forgiveness.
That's right, you don't say, stop it, right? You go back to the sacrifice because there's one sacrifice that deals with all of it, and it's Jesus, right? You have the sacrifice that puts you on the right side of God. So we're going to see, starting in this chapter and then carrying on through the next several, we're going to see how Jesus frees us from the curse of sin. We're going to see next week and the week after how Jesus frees us from the pollution of sin, because we're going to get to spreading skin diseases, that imagery of something that eats away at you. And what is it that can bring you back into the presence of God from having something that's eating away at you like that? Well, ultimately it's sacrifice, again. So all these different pictures, these metaphors of sin, communicate things about what Christ has accomplished for us in His death and resurrection.
Because they would have been cut off to an extent, right? Like they couldn't go to the tabernacle. They would have been
Right.
cut off from that fellowship until they were, or their wife was, or whatever, clean enough to go through. And we're not. I mean, just that picture. We don't have to think about all of those things so that we can then go to church and fellowship. Like we can go.
Right. But then think too, even about in the Christian life, are there not stages of purity in your own experience? Right? Where you're clean because you've been saved and Jesus has made you clean. But you're still told to pursue purity. Okay, so are you pure or aren't you? Yes. Right? You are because of what Christ has done for you, and yet what God says is now be who you are by pursuing the purity that God calls you to. So even in the Christian life, you're pursuing stages of purity, not because you want to get from one stage to the next, but because holiness and the intimacy with God are connected together. So, I mean, I'm sure that you can even think about points in your Christian life where at some point you were just like, I got to get rid of this. Like, I can't be doing this anymore because that's getting in the way of my relationship with the Lord. That's just part of Christian maturity, right? Is that you realize the things that this has got to go because I want a closer relationship with God, and I can't have that and this too. So even as Christians, we're in the process of being purified, even though we've been made pure by Christ. And how does that happen too? Because our faith is in the gospel and the Spirit is at work in us. So it's still not so much that you're purifying yourself, it's that you're walking in line with the Spirit. I saw you inhale, Donna.
I know. Well, I don't know. Sin separates you from God, and then it makes you feel guilty. And guilt is, not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So And when I was in Jackson, just day before yesterday, I went in the Whole Foods groceries and I got a luxury for me, a jar of Manuka honey. And I don't know if you guys know how expensive that honey is, but it's pretty expensive. And it was, I put it in my cart and I bought 2 items and then I walked out. And then I realized I didn't get charged for Manuka honey. And the checker didn't even see it. I was ready to put stuff in my car. And I thought, oh, Donna, you've got to go in and pay for it. You know, and I've done it with Tide laundry detergent. I've done it with distilled water at Safeway. You know, I've done it with other things, but here, this is really tempting to okay, I got a free jar of Manuka honey, you know. And, but I went back in and I paid, you know, because the guilt, I know that that is not right. And that guilt separates me from God. And so I went back in.
There's an alienation that you feel,
Mm-hmm.
that's best described as a distance, right?
Yeah.
Which makes all of these, the distances that are included in ritual impurity somehow appropriate even when it comes to spiritual things. This feeling like, okay, there's something between me and God and we got to get this sorted out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I always just use a little at a time in my tea, and I would every time I used it, I would feel, I really would.
You feel guilty every time you use it.
I would, at one time in my life I wouldn't have,
Yeah.
you know, but I would.
I've done that with lesser items, even at the groceries. I had, one time with a pack of gum, and I had to keep going. It was like, I gotta get out of here, but I went back and said, you need to charge me for this. And what's interesting in that is their response, or at least that was the case for me. They were amazed. I mean, I've done it with a little bit more than a pack of gum, but we're not entitled to anything, and it is interesting to me how people, they're not used to that for the most part.
Well, and then the thought goes through their head, they're a big corporation, and they're not gonna, $30 is nothing to them, you know, but then you stand back.
Well, and then think about that illustration of how such a small thing can put a distance between you and your God, right? So you could go back in and it might be that people see you come back in and pay for it and they're like, oh, you're just a goody two-shoes or whatever. You're not going back because you're a goody two-shoes, you're going back because you know what's going to happen if you don't. There's a relationship here that matters. How can something so small as a pack of gum get in the way of that relationship? But it can, right?
At the time, I didn't even know the price of it, because it wasn't marked. It could have been $80. You know, if it was $80, I wouldn't have, you know, it just was hidden. I took my bag in, you know, your recyclable bag, because, you know, they want to charge you 10 cents a bag or something. And so it was hidden under there, and I just,
So here's my question, you did that in Jackson Hole, what if you hadn't realized it until you were back in Lambert?
oh, I could call them and give them my credit card number. But, you know, when I was putting it in, I bought those little dates over there that nobody's eating. And, but it's okay. I understand. But, yeah, and then milk, I bought milk to drink, so.
So then think about just how all the things, the big and small things of daily life
Oh, yeah.
affect your relationship with God, right? Affect how you approach Him. I mean, if you start to feel guilty, doesn't there come a point where then you keep your distance? Doesn't it start to become hard to pray? If you have something you feel guilty about and you're not willing to deal with it? All of those things are, there's metaphors in Leviticus that are intended to communicate what's going on right there. That if you want closeness with God, you got to deal with the impurities. Because the relationship is more important than whatever it is that, you know, whatever that is, deal with it so you can come near to God. Not because God is off limits if you sin, but because if you want intimacy with Him, you have to pursue the things that reflect His character. And that's communicated in Leviticus in all these different metaphors for sin and purity and sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, you always come back to the sacrifice of Jesus. That's how we get peace with God. That's how we get free of the guilt. That's how we get free of the impurities and all. It's through the blood of Christ. Okay, last comments. Anything you want to add?
The woman with the issue that touched Jesus' robe, did he tell her to go make a sacrifice?
No.
He just, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that in about 4 weeks when we get to the whole chapter on bodily discharges. We're actually going to stop and talk about that passage in Mark chapter 4. It's very interesting what happens when impurity comes in contact with Jesus.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Very, very interesting. Yeah.
And so with Jesus, all these rituals went away too, right? I can't believe the Jews won't honor Jesus, won't.
Well,
They'd rather
I
keep
mean,
doing
we're-
their
To
rituals.
do the thing, right? Like, I had a conversation with a former Catholic the other night, and she was saying that one of the things that she misses about, kind of growing up in that more ritualistic thing is going to confession. Like, it was something that she could do. Like, you do this thing, and she understands, the difference now, but it really made me think about, kind of the sacrificial system, and it was something that you could do. But it just, today thinking about like the tearing of the veil, we don't have to do these things. We're not separated from God in the same way that we would have been then. Like we can go freely anytime, whether we're clean at the moment or not, which we never are, right? But yeah, it makes me wonder if it's because of the things that you can do that make you feel better
They
somehow.
miss the ritual.
And
I
those-
don't know.
Those things that you're talking about doing involve another human being. She would go to confession and the priest would hear her and give her an assignment.
Right, yeah.
In further back in Old Testament times, they would take their sacrifice to the priest, the intercessor, and that intercessor would do that, and everybody would see it and know that you had gone through that. So that's something we have our intercessor as Jesus Christ now, and it becomes a more personal relationship.
Yeah. The woman who's with the issue where she's bleeding all the time, it's really interesting when you even look at this passage to think, okay, anything the woman touches becomes unclean until she touches Jesus. And then it goes the other way. If you're a Jew watching that, and you have the background of Leviticus in your head, you ought to be standing there watching that and thinking, who's that guy?
Yeah.
Like, who is he that his cleanness cleanses her instead of her uncleanness contaminating him?
And her uncleanness she wasn't ever free from it.
No, 10 years?
No.
12 years.
And she
That's
was
right.
in that crowd of people making them all unclean.
No, she was.
Did they know?
I don't think
Or
so.
was
Not
no?
until-
Not until
Not
Jesus
until
called her
God.
out in front of everybody, which is really interesting. And it's not only that his cleanness cleanses her, but it's that his holiness doesn't destroy her, which according to Leviticus it should,
Well, yeah, we just had
right?
two priests who
Yep.
offered profane fire and food. They were gone.
So again, if you're a Jew watching this
Yeah.
and thinking on Leviticus, you gotta be thinking, you gotta have a million questions going through your head right now. Who could that guy be that he can get rid of that ritual impurity by touching her? And at the same time, it doesn't destroy her. I mean, he has to be permanently holy to be able to touch her and make her clean. But if he's permanently holy, how is it that it doesn't destroy her? And then you got to be thinking, okay, what if what's permanently holy came in contact with something that's permanently unclean. Like, for example, a dead body. Would a dead body make Jesus unclean?
Yeah, I called it out of the tomb.
The only way that Jesus could touch a dead body and not become unclean is if the deadness gets reversed. Which is not a coincidence, it's the very next thing that happens after the woman with the blood problem, is Jesus raises a little girl from the dead. Because, again, from the background of Leviticus, now he's got the ultimate uncleanness, which is a dead body, and there's no way to make it clean, unless you make it alive. And that's what the holiness of Jesus does.
So Sally, in some way, even his making her unclean helped them. I mean, they now weren't suffering a consequence for having touched her, because now she's not unclean, right?
I think that Leviticus sets the stage for Jesus to be revealed.
To what?
For Jesus to be revealed in really profound ways. Where, if that's the air that you breathe, you're watching Jesus do things, and you just are thinking, he is in a different category from anybody. Like, he just rewrote the playbook, and who does he have to be to do that? Well, he has to be God. I don't see any way around that. There are plenty of people who do miracles, but there's nobody who's permanently holy except for God. Getting way ahead of myself. We're going to talk about that in 4 weeks, but okay. Any last comments? You want to add anything? Okay. Stop there. You have things to pray about?